Hello, hello. Welcome back to Hillbilly Elegy with Monique Josephine. That's me. We are on chapter 3. I have really enjoyed this book, and I just can't stop reading it. I was going to read it live today, but after I checked my channel, I can't do that until I have more subscribers. So please subscribe because I would love to just read this live every day. I think it's a lot easier than all of the tinkering around with the videos and uploading them at a certain time every day. So without further ado, here we go. Mama and Papa had 3 kids: Jimmy, Bev, my mom, and Lori. Jimmy was born in 1951 when Mama and Papa were integrating into their new lives. They wanted more children, so they tried and tried. Through the heartbreaking period of terrible luck and numerous miscarriages, Mama carried the emotional scars of 9 lost children for her entire life. In college, I learned that extreme stress can cause miscarriages. And this is especially true during the early part of a pregnancy. I can't help but wonder how many additional aunts and uncles I'd have today were it not for my grandparents' difficult early transition, no doubt intensified by Papa's years of hard drinking. Yet they persisted through a decade of failed pregnancies, and eventually it paid off. Mom was born January 20th, 1961. The day of John F. Kennedy's inauguration. My Aunt Lori came along less than 2 years later. For whatever reason, Mama and Papa stopped there. Uncle Jimmy once told me about the time before his sisters were born. We were just a happy, normal, middle-class family. I remember watching Leave It to Beaver on TV and thinking that looked like us. When he first told me this, I nodded attentively and left it alone. Looking back, I realized that to most outsiders, a statement like that must come off as insane. Normal middle class parents don't wreck pharmacies because a store clerk is mildly rude to their child. But that's probably the wrong standard to use. Destroying store merchandise and threatening a sales clerk were normal to Mama and Papa. That's what Scotch-Irish Appalachians do when people mess with your kid. What I mean is that they were united. They were getting along with each other. Uncle Jimmy conceded when I later pressed him. But yeah, like everyone else in our family, they could go from zero to murderous in a effing heartbeat. Whatever unity they possessed early in their marriage began to evaporate after their daughter Lori, whom I called Aunt Wee, was born in 1962. By the mid-60s, Papa's drinking had become habitual. Mama began to shut herself off from the outside world. Neighborhood kids warned the mailman to avoid the evil witch of McKinney Street. When the mailman ignored their advice, he met a large woman with an extra large menthol cigarette hanging out of her mouth who told him to stay the F off of her property. Hoarder hadn't entered the everyday parlance, but Mama fit the bill, and her tendencies only worsened as she withdrew from the world. Garbage piled up in the house, with an entire bedroom devoted to trinkets and debris that had no earthly value. To hear of this period, one gets the sense that Mama and Papa led 2 lives. There was the outward public life. It included work during the day, preparing the kids for school. This was a life that everyone else saw, and by all measures, it was quite successful. My grandfather earned a wage that was almost unfathomable to friends back home. He liked his work and did it well. Their children went to modern, well funded schools, and my grandmother lived in a home that was, by Jackson standards, a mansion. 2,000 square feet, 4 bedrooms, modern plumbing. Home life was different. I didn't notice it at first as a teenager. Uncle Jimmy recalled, "At that age, you're just so wrapped up in your own stuff that you hardly recognize the change. But it was there. Dad stayed out more. Mom stopped keeping the house. Dirty dishes and junk piled up everywhere. They fought a lot more. It was all around a rough time." Hillbilly culture at the time, and maybe now, blended a robust sense of honor, devotion to family, and bizarre sexism into a sometimes explosive mix. Before Mama was married, her brothers had been willing to murder boys who disrespected their sister. Now that she was married to a man whom many of them considered more like a brother than an outsider, they tolerated behavior that would have gotten Papa killed in the holler. Mom's brothers would come up and want to go carousing with Dad. Uncle Jimmy explained. They'd go drinking and chasing women. Uncle Pet was the leader. I didn't want to hear about it, but I always did. It was that culture from back then that expected the men were going to go out and do what they wanted to do. Mama felt disloyalty acutely. She loathed anything that smacked of a lack of complete devotion. In her own home, she'd say things like, "I'm sorry I'm so damn mean," and "You know I love you, but I'm just a crazy bee." But if she knew anyone criticizing so much as her socks to an outsider, she'd fly off the handle. "I don't know those people. You never talk about family to some stranger. Never." My sister Lindsay and I could fight like cats and dogs in her home, and for the most part, she'd let us figure things out alone. But if I told a friend that my sister was hateful and Mama overheard, she'd remember it and tell me the next time we were alone that I had committed the cardinal sin of disloyalty. "How dare you speak about your sister to some little shit? In 5 years, you won't even remember his GD name. But your sister is the only true friend you'll ever have." Yet, in her own life, with 3 children at home, the men who should have been most loyal to her, her brothers and husband, conspired against her. Papa seemed to resist the social expectations of a middle-class father, sometimes with hilarious results. He would announce that he was headed to the store and ask if the kids needed anything. He'd come back with a brand new car, a new Chevrolet convertible one month, a luxurious Oldsmobile the next. "Where'd you get that?" they'd ask him. "It's mine. I traded for it," he'd reply nonchalantly. But sometimes his failure to conform brought terrible consequences. My young aunt and mother would play a little game when their father came home. Some days he would carefully park his car and the game would go well. Their father would come inside. They'd have dinner together like a normal family. They'd make one another laugh. Many days, however, he wouldn't park his car normally. He'd back into a spot too quickly, or sloppily leave his car on the road, or even sideswipe a telephone pole as he maneuvered. Those days, the game was already lost. Mom and Aunt Wee would run inside and tell Mama that Papa had come home drunk. Sometimes they'd run out the back door and stay the night with Mama's friends. Other times, Mama would insist on staying, so Mom and Aunt Wee would brace for a long night. One Christmas Eve, Papa came home drunk and demanded a fresh dinner. When that failed to materialize, he picked up the family Christmas tree and threw it out the back door. The next year, he greeted a crowd at his daughter's birthday party and promptly coughed up a huge wad of phlegm at everyone's feet. Then he smiled and walked off to grab him another beer. I couldn't believe that mild-mannered Papa, whom I adored as a child, was such a violent drunk. His behavior was due at least partly to Mama's disposition. She was a violent non-drunk, and she channeled her frustrations into the most productive activity imaginable: covert war. When Papa passed out on the couch, she'd cut his pants with scissors so they'd burst at the seams the next time he sat down. Or she'd steal his wallet and hide it in the oven just to piss him off. When he came home from work and demanded fresh dinner, she'd carefully prepare a plate of fresh garbage. If he was in a fighting mood, she'd fight back. In short, she devoted herself to making his drunken life a living hell. If Jimmy's youth shielded him from the signs of their deteriorating marriage for a bit, the problem soon reached an obvious nadir. Uncle Jimmy recalled one fight. I could hear furniture bumping and bumping. They were yelling and getting into it. They were both screaming. I went downstairs to beg them to stop, but they didn't stop. Mama grabbed a flower vase, hurled it, and it split. Mama grabbed a flower vase, hurled it, and she always had hell of an arm. It hit Papa right between the eyes. It split his forehead wide open, and he was bleeding really badly when he got into his car and drove off. That's what I went to school thinking about the next day. Mama told Papa, after a particularly violent night of drinking, that if he ever came home drunk again, she'd kill him. A week later, he came home drunk again and fell asleep on the couch. Mama, never one to tell a lie, calmly retrieved a gasoline canister from the garage and poured it all over her husband, lit a match, and dropped it on his chest. When Papa burst into flames, their 11-year-old daughter jumped into action, to put out the fire and save his life. Miraculously, Papa survived the episode with only mild burns. Because they were hill people, they had to keep their two lives separate. No outsider could know about the family strife, with outsiders defined very broadly. When Jimmy turned 18, he took a job at Armco and moved out. Not long after he left, Aunt Wee found herself in the middle of one particularly bad fight, and Papa punched her in the face. The blow, though accidental, left a nasty black eye. When Jimmy, her own brother, returned home for a visit, Aunt Wee was made to hide in the basement. Because Jimmy didn't live with the family anymore, he was not to know about the inner workings of the house. That's just how everyone, especially Mama, dealt with things. Aunt Wee said it was just too embarrassing. It's not obvious to anyone why Mama and Papa's marriage fell apart. Perhaps Papa's alcoholism got the best of him. Uncle Jimmy suspects that he eventually ran around on Mama. Or maybe Mama just cracked. With 3 living kids, 1 dead, and a host of miscarriages in between, who could have blamed her? Despite their violent marriage, Mama and Papa always maintain a measured optimism about their children's futures. They reasoned that if they could go from a 1-room schoolhouse in Jackson to a 2-story suburban home with comforts of the middle class, then their children and grandchildren should have no problem attending college and acquiring a share of the American dream. They were unquestionably wealthier than the family members who had stayed in Kentucky. They visited the Atlantic Ocean and Niagara Falls as adults, despite never traveling farther than Cincinnati as children. They believed that they had made it and their children would go even further. There was something deeply naive about that attitude, though. All three children were profoundly affected by their tumultuous home life. Papa wanted Jimmy to get an education instead of slogging it out at the steel mill. He warned that if Jimmy got a full-time job out of high school, the money would be like a drug. It would feel good in the short term, but it would keep him from the things that he ought to be doing. Papa even prevented Jimmy from using him as a referral on his Armco application. What Papa didn't appreciate was that Armco offered something more than money: the ability to get out of a house where your mother threw vases at your father's forehead. Lori struggled in school, mostly because she never attended class. Mama used to joke that she'd drive her to school, drop her off, and somehow Lori would beat her home. During her sophomore year of high school, Lori's boyfriend stole some PCP, and the two of them returned to Mama's to indulge. He told me that he should do more since he was bigger. That was the last thing I remembered. Lori woke up when Mama and her friend Kathy placed Lori in a cold bathtub. Her boyfriend, meanwhile, wasn't responding. Kathy couldn't tell if the young man was breathing. Mama ordered her to drag him to the park across the street. "I don't want him to die in my effing house," she said. Instead, she called someone to take him to the hospital, where he spent 5 days in intensive care. The next year, at 16, Lori dropped out of high school and she married. She immediately found herself trapped in an abusive home, just like the one she had tried to escape. Her new husband would lock her in the bedroom to keep her from seeing her family. It was almost like a prison, Aunt Wee would later tell me. Fortunately, both Jimmy and Lori found their way. Jimmy worked his way through night school and landed a sales job with Johnson & Johnson. He was the first person in my family to have a career. By the time she turned 30, Lori was working in radiology and had such a nice new husband that Mama told the entire family, "If they ever get divorced, I'm following him." Unfortunately, the statistics caught up with the Vance family, and Bev, my mom, didn't fare so well. Like her siblings, she left home early. She was a promising student, but when she got pregnant at 18, she decided that college had to wait. After high school, she married her boyfriend and tried to settle down. But settling down wasn't quite her thing. She had learned the lessons of her childhood all too well. When her new life developed the same fighting and drama so present in her old one, Mom filed for divorce and began life as a single mother. She was 19 with no degree, no husband, and a little girl, my sister, Lindsay. Mama and Papa eventually got their act together. Papa quit drinking in 1983, a decision accompanied by no medical intervention and not much fanfare. He simply stopped and said little about it. Gosh, you have to love that generation that's like, toughen up. He just stopped, and that was it. He's like, "Yep, today's the day I'm done." Okay. He and Mama separated and then reconciled. And although they continued to live in separate houses, they spent nearly every waking hour together, and they tried to repair the damage they had brought. They helped Lori break out of her abusive marriage. They lent money to Bev and helped her with childcare. They offered her places to stay, supported her through rehab, and paid for her nursing school. Most important, they filled the gap when my mom was unwilling or unable to be the type of parent that they wished they had been to her. Mama and Papa have failed Bev. Mama and Papa may have failed Bev in her youth, but they spent the rest of their lives making up for it. Okay, this is now chapter 4, but I want to make a comment about that because I come from 6 siblings where my older sister is 10 years older than me. And We had the most completely different childhoods. Like, when she talks about my dad as a kid, I'm like, oh my God, he was so mean, But to me, like calling her beautiful, she's like, dad really never called me beautiful. And I'm like, wow, he definitely called me beautiful. Like, I think I got a little taste of what my dad would have been if he were my grandfather. But his grandkids got the softest version of him that we all were just like, how? Who is this man letting these children walk all over him? It's the sweetest thing. It honestly is. I love it. Okay, let's continue on just a little bit longer. I was born in late summer of 1984, just a few months before Papa cast his first and only vote for a Republican, Ronald Reagan. Could you imagine if he saw JD, if his papa saw JD on the ballot? That's just wild. Winning large blocks of Rust Belt Democrats like Papa, Reagan went on to the biggest electoral landslide in modern American history until now. I never liked Reagan much, Papa later told me, but I hated that son of a bee, Mondale. Reagan's Democratic opponent, a well-educated Northern liberal, stood in stark cultural contrast to my hillbilly papa. Mondale never had a chance. And after he departed from the political scene, Papa never again voted against his beloved party of the working man. Jackson, Kentucky would always have my heart, but Middletown, Ohio had most of my time. In many ways, the town where I was born was largely the same as the one my grandparents had migrated to 4 decades earlier. Its population had changed little since the 1950s, when the flood of migrants on the Hillbilly Highway slowed to a dribble. My elementary school was built in the 1930s, before my grandparents left Jackson, and my middle school first welcomed a class shortly after World War I, well before my grandparents were born. Armco remained the town's biggest employer, and though troubling signs were on the horizon, Middletown had avoided significant economic problems. We saw ourselves as a really fine community, on par with Shaker Heights or Upper Arlington, explained a decades-long veteran of the public schools, comparing the Middletown of yore to some of the most successful Ohio suburbs. Of course, none of us knew what would happen. Middletown is one of the oldest incorporated towns in Ohio, built during the 1800s thanks to its proximity to the Miami River, which emptied directly into the Ohio. As kids, we joked that our hometown was so generic they didn't even bother to give it a real name. It's the middle of Cincinnati and Dayton. It's a town. So here we are. It's not alone. A few miles from Middletown is Centerville. Middletown is generic in other ways. It exemplified economic expansion of the manufacturing Rust Belt. Socioeconomically, it is largely working class. Racially, there are lots of whites and black people, the later product of an analogous Great Migration, but few others. And culturally, it's very conservative. Although cultural conservatism and political conservatism are not always aligned in Middleton. The people I grew up around are not all that disfamiliar from the people of Jackson. This is especially obvious at Armco, which employed a plurality of the townspeople. Indeed, the work environment once mirrored the Kentucky towns that many of the employees came from. One author reported that a sign over the doorway between departments read, "Leave Morgan County, enter Wolfe County." Kentucky down to its county rivalries, moved with Appalachian migrants to town. As a kid, I sorted Middletown into three basic geographic regions. First, the area surrounding the high school, which opened in 1969, Uncle Jimmy's senior year. Even in 2003, Mama called it the new high school. The rich kids lived here. Large home, mixed comfortably with well-kept parks and office complexes. If your dad was a doctor, he almost certainly owned a home or had an office here. If not both. I dreamed that I'd own a house in Manchester Manor, a relatively new development not a mile from the high school, where a nice home went for less than a fifth of the price of a decent house in San Francisco. Next, the poor kids, the really poor kids, lived near Armco, where even the nice homes had been converted into multifamily apartment units. I didn't know until recently that this neighborhood was actually two neighborhoods. One inhabited by Middleton's working class black population, the other by the poorest white population. Middleton's few housing projects stood there. Then there was the area where we lived, mostly single-family homes with abandoned warehouses and factories within walking distance. I'm sorry, that's terrible. With abandoned warehouses with abandoned warehouses and factories within walking distance. Looking back, I don't know if the really poor areas and my block were any different, or whether these divisions were the construct of the mind that I didn't want to believe it was really poor. Across the street from our house was Miami Park, a single city block with a swing set, a tennis court, a basketball field, a baseball court. As I grew up, I noticed that the tennis court lines faded with each passing month, and that the city had stopped filling in the cracks or replacing the nets on the basketball courts. I was still young when the tennis courts became a little more than a cement block littered with grass patches. I learned that our neighborhood had gone downhill after 2 bikes were stolen in the course of 1 week. For years, Mama said her children had left their bikes unchained in the yard with no problems. Now her grandkids woke to find thick locks cracked by 2 deadbolt cutters. From that point forward, I walked. If Middletown had changed little by the time I was born, the writing was on the wall almost immediately thereafter. It's easy even for residents to miss it because the change has been so gradual. More erosion than a mudslide. But it's obvious if you know where to look. And common reframe for those of us who return intermittently is, geez, Middletown is not looking good. In the 1980s, Middletown had a proud, almost idyllic downtown, a bustling shopping center, restaurants that had operated since before World War II, and a few bars where men like Papa would gather to have a beer, or many, after a hard day at the steel mill. My favorite store was the local Kmart, which was the main attraction in a strip mall, near a branch of Dillman's, a local grocer with 3 or 4 locations. Now the strip mall is mostly bare. Kmart stands empty. The Dillman's family closed that big store and all the rest too. Last I checked, there was only an Arby's, a discount grocery store, and a Chinese buffet in what was once a Middletown center of commerce. The scene at the strip mall is hardly uncommon. Few Middletown businesses are doing well, and many have ceased operation altogether. 22 years ago, there were 2 local malls. Now one of those malls is a parking lot, and the other serves as a walking course for the elderly, though it still has a few stores. Today, downtown Middleton is little more than a relic of American industrial glory. Abandoned shops with broken windows line the heart of downtown, where Central Avenue and Main Street meet. Richie's pawn shop has long since closed, though a hideous yellow and green sign still marks the site, so far as I know. Richie's isn't far from an old pharmacy that in its heyday had a soda bar that served root beer floats. Across the street is a building that looks like a theater with one of those giant triangular signs that reads STL because the letters in the middle were shattered and never replaced. If you need a payday lender or cash for gold store, downtown Middleton is the place to be. Not far from the main drag of the empty shops and boarded up windows of the Sorg Mansion. The Sorg is a powerful and wealthy industrial family dating back to the 19th century. Operated a large paper mill in Middleton. They donated enough money to put their names on the local opera house and help build Middleton into a respectable enough city to attract Armco. Their mansion, a gigantic manor home, sits near a formerly proud Middleton country club. Despite its beauty, a Maryland couple recently purchased the mansion for $225,000, or about half of what a decent multi-room apartment sets you back in Washington. Okay, come here. Come here. This is my little roadie. I've introduced you already, but in case you missed it, she is my foster fail. And I have to put her down because she's ready to go. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to finish this up. Sorry about that, guys. Don't even worry about it. Okay, nothing to see here. Okay. Or about half of what a decent multi-room apartment sets you back in Washington, D.C. Located quite literally on Main Street, Sorg Mountain is just up the road from a number of opulent homes that housed Middletown's wealthy in their heyday. Most have fallen into despair. Those that haven't have been subdivided into small apartments for Middletown's poorest residents. A street that was once the pride of Middleton today serves as a meeting spot for druggies and dealers. Main Street is now the place you avoid after dark. This change is a symptom of a new economic reality, rising residential segregation. The number of working-class whites in high-poverty neighborhoods is growing. In the 1970s, 25% of white children lived in a neighborhood with poverty rates above 10%. In 2000, that number was 40%. It's almost certainly even higher today. As a 2011 Brookings Institute study found, compared to the 2000s, residents of extreme poverty neighborhoods in 2005 to 2009 were most likely to be white native-born high school or college graduates, homeowners, not receiving public assistance. In other words, bad neighborhoods no longer plagued only urban ghettos. The bad neighborhoods have spread to the suburbs. This occurred for complicated reason. Federal housing policy has actively encouraged homeownership, from Jimmy Carter's Community Reinvestment Act to George W. Bush's Ownership Society. But in the Middletowns of the world, home ownership comes at a steep social cost. As jobs disappear in any given area, declining home values trap people in certain neighborhoods. Even if you'd like to move, you can't because the bottom has fallen out of the market. You now owe more than any buyer is willing to pay. The costs of moving are so high that many people stay put. Of course, the people trapped are usually those with the least amount of money. Those who can afford to leave do so. City leaders have tried in vain to revive Middletown's downtown. You'll find their most infamous effort if you follow Central Avenue to its endpoint on the banks of the Miami River. Once a lovely place, For reasons I can't begin to fathom, the city's brain trust decided to turn our beautiful riverfront into Lake Middleton, an infrastructural project that apparently involved shoveling tons of dirt into the river and hoping something interesting would come out of it. It accomplished nothing, though the river now features a man made dirt island about the size of a city block. Efforts to revive downtown Middleton always struck me as futile. People didn't leave because our downtown lacked trendy cultural amenities. The trendy cultural amenities left because there weren't enough customers in Middletown to support them. And why weren't there enough well-paying consumers? Because there weren't enough jobs to employ those consumers. Downtown Middleton's struggles were a symptom of everything else happening to Middletown's people, especially the collapsing importance of Armco Kawasaki Steel. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop there because my little baby Rudy is trying to tell me she has to go out. And I know that's kind of a weird place to stop, but that's what we're doing. I really appreciate, I know I have right now like one listener. And if you've made it this far, I want you to know I really appreciate it. You could spend your time doing anything, and the fact that you chose to listen to my choppy reading and goofy breakoffs, I really do appreciate it. I hope that you enjoyed this episode of Hillbilly Elegy. My name is Monique Josephine, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Ciao.